Our speaker today has 25 years of horticultural experience. He's worked as a retail manager and nursery manager for Digger Seeds, and he's going to give you a presentation on small space veggie gardening. His name is Ryan Garrett, so I'll hand over to Ryan.
Well, good morning everyone. So I won't go too much into the wicking thing because Darren will be doing that later. But talking about general principles of small space gardening. So variety, well, I suppose one thing I will say to start with is whatever you're growing, it's the soil, or in the case of something like this, the growing media that's going to dictate your success. So don't get the shovel and go get some old dirty stuff from down the back corner. Don't skimp on what you're growing it in. That's number one with any gardening, whether you're a flower gardener or food gardener. Always make sure in ground, build your soil up, lots of compost. In the case of filling it with a growing media, so soilless growing, make sure it's a good one. And yeah, that's probably sometimes that'll be the most expensive part of the whole operation. And then manage it, I suppose, in a, if you look at the concepts of crop rotation. So crop rotation, if you look in some textbooks, it can just be daunting and really dense and maybe overcomplicated and tells you have to grow this and this and this, and you might not necessarily, there might be things that it tells you to grow that you're not interested in growing or eating, so don't grow them. But essentially, when you've got your first rotation in crop rotation, you've got beautiful, fresh, built-up soil, and so that first crop rotation is really heavy feeding stuff. So we're coming into spring, so the classics for heavy feeders would be tomatoes in the spring-summer cropping. But most things with fruit, essentially, so not the leafy stuff, so pumpkins. Corn itself is pretty heavy feeder. We actually grew at Diggers, trialled some quite interesting, really ancient corn varieties. And they're very hard to keep water up to corn. So we did them in these because it's very easy to keep water up. There's one beautiful corn called Bloody Butcher, which essentially you rip it open and it is...
The other bench?
You can't eat it off the cob, but it was beautiful. And these really helped us out with that. But heavy feeders, first rotation. In the winter garden, so probably what you'll be pulling out right about now or very soon, it can be a bit harder to figure out what a heavy feeder is, but broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, it's that sort of, the brassicas that form lots of florets as opposed to like a cabbage that forms a leaf or a turnip that forms a tuber. So that's your winter heavy feeders. But in saying that, when you're in small space gardening, you'll plant plants that are quite small to start with, like broccoli is a great example, and it'll grow quite large. A lot of broccolis can be quite large and they can take quite a bit of time before you get any harvest off them. So any space that you've got, put something really quick in. So lettuce, leafy green lettuce is a classic. The quickest and easiest thing, I was talking to someone about what vegetables to grow if you're trying to get kids into gardening, and someone suggested radish because there's nothing quicker in horticulture and nothing easier, but not all kids like to eat it, I suppose. I love it, but that's just me. I just absolutely love it. But really quick stuff. So it's called intercropping basically. So you sort of think, how long is this crop going to take? How much space is it going to take? But can I fit in a really quick picking lettuce? Can I fit in radishes? Radish greens are really good too, like a really peppery rocket. So you get a leaf crop, but exceptionally quick things to grow. And quite a bit of variety too, like there's typical French radish. So, the European tradition of radish is you breed them small and colourful and very peppery, And then exactly the same plant from the same origins. The Asian tradition is you breed them big and milder and more of a cooking veg. Well, you can eat them fresh as well, but big daikons. So kind of like this interesting split in radishes for very different purposes. Whereas European tradition in pumpkins, we have traditionally in heirloom vegetables big pumpkins, and the Japanese like ones you fit on your palm. So that's your first two rotations. Your third rotation would be legumes. Now legumes, whether you're growing them in a container or the ground, have a very long taproot, and they have a sort of a relationship with bacteria that they'll be, whether you're in the soil or in that, they'll be there. And they get nitrogen from the atmosphere and then put it out through nodes on the root system. And so they kind of fertilise themselves from the air, or fertilise other plants around them. They're really good at aerating too, because they've got that really good taproot. So that would be peas and beans basically. So summer would be beans, and winter, or you plant at the end of summer, but would be your peas. Which again, if you're in small space gardening, I've talked to a lot of people about variety in small space gardening, because there's all sorts of different growing habits and cropping times. And a lot of people think that a small bush pea or bean or the little bush tomatoes are a better option. But if you have a look at the trellising, a bush tomato, you can actually get better vertical space by having a traditional tomato than you can, like a vining tomato, than you can by bush tomatoes. And bush tomatoes, so an indeterminate tomato, which is what a bush tomato is, it'll start to flower and set fruit and stop growing. And it's sort of self-supporting and be this little bush. But it's a very quick cropping period. So for the home gardener, I don't think it's great because you get all your fruit in a very short period of time. Whereas an heirloom, a lot of commercial hybrids are bred for commercial cropping. So you'll just get one crop, so you don't have to go out all the time. The home gardener probably just wants a handful, and then 3 to 5 days later you go out and there's another one ripe. And that would definitely be your traditional heirloom tomatoes. They're bred for gardening, not for factory farming, I suppose, is one way to look at it. But that would be your third rotation. And then you want to before you do something like these carrots you can see here, or most other root crops that are, you want to suck a lot of the excess nutrients out. And you do that with leafy greens, so silver beets, spinaches, rockets, masunas, lettuces obviously. And that sort of sucks any excess out, and then you can do root cropping before you sort of build that soil up again. Whether you're in the ground or in a pot, I know a lot of you may have grown, think you've got a beautiful crop of carrots because you've got greens going berserk up the top, and you pull them up and there's nothing there. And that's because there's too much nutrient. So a carrot, and all plants, are very efficient. I love plants, obviously, that's why I do what I do. And one of the things I love about them is just how efficient they are. They only do what they have to. We might waste a lot of energy in the course of our day, and plants, if they won't do it. If there's nutrient available, the carrots come from sandy, sloped, leached, reasonably high rainfall, but naturally leached soil, so not a lot of nutrient at all, which is why they grow that big root. So they can sort of mine for nutrients and store it for tough times. Now, if there's nutrient all around that plant, there's absolutely no reason to swell a root and do that, and they don't. But beautiful greens, pull them up, nothing there. So through that crop rotation, you get to manage. So if you have, depending on your space, if you're talking about food cubes, that link up beautifully, so you've got one water reservoir between a whole bunch of beds. Yep. Yeah, it's you just rotate your cropping around.
We'll just find it a week and a half years.
But always fill space, I suppose. Another concept so looking at varieties, definitely thinking about that vertical space. So the use of trellising. You could even have things trailing down the side of something like this. So you sort of want to use as much space as you can. Another concept, I suppose, that if you look in some of the diggers' publications over the years in the books, there's a thing called the mini plot. And a mini plot, I mean, this translates as a mini plot. In fact, at Heronswood, we're recreating that mini plot with these. So it's well up and running, but it's like a courtyard garden within a larger garden. And it is that sort of mini plot. So the selection of varieties is part of it. Like you might not want, say, silver beet. Silver beet, very easy to grow. It's perennial, lives for years. Probably about 3 years before you replace it. Now, Ford Hook Giant, I'm a country boy, so I've got lots of garden. So I grow Ford Hook Giant, and it's like, this big. And I've got chooks, and chooks get more of it than I do because I've got too much of it. But you can grow what perpetual spinach is what it's often called, or Swiss chards, what my grandmother called it. So it's silver beet, but it's this high, and it's much softer, not as bitter and much softer stem. So pick those sort of varieties. And traditionally, like I remember my father's vegetable garden, and he was in the army and then police force, very regimented man. Measured rows, perfectly measured rows, all of one thing. He actually did. I've never measured the spacing with a ruler in any planting I've ever done in my life, but he measured every single one. But always in a grid fashion. So you want to make the most, you want to fit more in, but you need light and air as well. So you don't need, so instead of having, a grid fashion where you've got one plant there, if you offset, and like in a square, if you offset them, like so have your next row here, it gives you just that little bit more space that you can come in. And you'll only be making, each row, you're only making that much, but you get to the end of your bed or container or whatever you're growing in, and it's like a whole another 2 rows. So think about how you do that. It does also help with evaporation, because instead of having, in traditional rows you have a Dutch, like a swan-necked hoe or something, and there's a lot of light hitting in between your 2 rows, and no plant there, so there's going to be something pop up that you don't want there. So you hoe the weeds out. If you're creating canopy, you're not getting the sun hitting the darker soil and creating maybe too much heat at the root system, and you're getting much less germination because the seed that might get dropped by the wind or a bird or something doesn't get the light it needs to germinate. So it does help with that, as well as giving you that space and evaporation and soil temperature regulation. So definitely think about that sort of side of it. And as I said, that intercropping is a very big part of it, and succession planting is a very big part of it, which is basically, I'll use carrots as an example, because you can buy a pack of carrot seed and there's like 250 seeds in it. So it's a lot of carrots. And you'll get it, if you sow them all at once and they've all got the same conditions, you're going to have a lot of carrots, like all at once. So think about that. And lettuce is the same, and I would suggest growing these things from seed. Then it's a pretty easy sort of thing to do and much more economical. But it instead of, like, if you go and buy a punnet of lettuce, you're planting a punnet of lettuce, and also you're paying $5-6 for what is 6 seeds, like instead of $4 or $5 for a lot of seed. But and don't sow them all at once. Like, so maybe leave a week or 2, depending on cropping times of particular varieties of plants, and then sow another row or another block, or you don't need to sow in rows, and fill space. is basically it. Fill space, but still you want airflow, otherwise you'll get pest and disease problems. Another one thing I do love about this sort of setup is I've got a very, very traditional type large vegetable garden, and it's very easy for snails and slugs to, if I'm not vigilant, to get where I don't want them. It's pretty hard crawling up that. It's quite hard. So better and I would think, I don't have too much problem with rabbits, but I do know a lot of people in the country that do, that they try and grow stuff and it just gets munched to the ground. A hare is big enough, they'll be able to climb up that, but rabbits as well. So pest and disease, it does help, but do make sure, like I'll go out into my veggie patch because I know I want light to a degree, not, I don't want it all things overshadowing, but I certainly want airflow going through the crops, so you don't get mildews and bacterias that you don't want. So even if I'm not harvesting, so I'll use silver beet and beetroot, which are kind of two versions of the same thing. Like I'll be out there preening them basically, so big leaves that are sort of, they're probably past where I would want to eat them, but they're shading it out too much. So once a week I'll be out in the garden and I quite enjoy it. Just, chopping sets of leaves off, letting a little bit more light in, and that can go in the compost, or worm farm, or in my case to the chooks. And then it turns into eggs. It's a good use of it. So I suppose I'm by my excess growing of silver beet, I'm keeping myself in eggs. But yeah, so always fill space, timing as well, and timing in it, whether you're in a small space or not. Timing is one of those things, and there is 2 seasons, but there's not two. It's not 2 blocks that are clear cut. There's a lot of grey area in between, and there's a lot of, the longer you garden, the more seasons you garden, the more sort of variables you come across. So we've had 3 years of cold springs, wet springs. Now it's funny saying this today because we've just had wet and it's sort of a lot colder than it has been. But we've also had some pretty warm, warm weather. And you sort of want to know whatever variety that you want to grow, particularly, you want to know what is the length of time to harvest and how. Even have a look on the Bureau of Meteorology site. They'll tell you for wherever you are what your average day is at this temperature. What's the maximum average temperature? What's the minimum average temperature? How does that relate to something you want to grow? So I'll use the winter. If you've got a cherry tomato in something like this, and it'll crop longer than you need it in there. So you kind of, as a gardener, have to go, right, if I don't start late summer, early autumn, if I don't start that winter veg, don't start sowing peas and leeks and onions and certainly all the brassicas, the broccolis, and one of my favourite vegetables that would be great in small space gardening is kohlrabi, which is it's a brassica as well, but instead of growing florets or leaves or a tuber like a turnip does, it just swells its stem. So it's like that beautiful crunchy sweet part of cauliflower, and it looks cool. It looks like a 1960s sci-fi, like Lost in Space. It's this, there's white and purple ones, but they don't really taste any different. But the purple one looks really cool, like this ball with leaves coming out of it. Kohlrabi. Very expensive too. Like it's a good, because it's not a major crop, or even, my mother grew up in the Netherlands, so that's probably why I love it, because it's popular in Europe and not so much, I suppose, in the Australian garden tradition. So they're like, $5 each for like one.
They're my favourite.
But yeah, easy to grow. They just take a little bit of time, but very unforgiving. There's one crop I grew when I was in quite a small garden before, that I was a bit late in the timing, but I wanted to grow it, and I knew I was too late in the timing. Now that was 18 months in the ground, and I had to just keep arresting the flowers. So that's one that, you know, if we're having dinner with friends, my partner likes to, you know, talk about my gardening prowess. The kohlrabi crop comes up quite a bit. So yeah, remember that kohlrabi crop that you grew and you just stubbornly wouldn't rip it out and put something else?
How do you cook it?
It's really, much like, say, a daikon with different sort of flavour notes in that it's really, you can grate it raw, you can roast it, you can make a, that crop went into one dish too because they were quite small even after that amount of time. And I had to chop, they were also grown too long, so the outside was a little bit woodier than I would want. But I just, you know, so I chopped quite a bit off and made a hazelnut meal and pureed kohlrabi soup. It was bloody nice, actually. I was very proud of it. The soup doesn't get talked about when my crop gets talked about. I have to raise that one. But you have a great opportunity as a gardener to garden proactively, I suppose, and you make a decision. So you go, well, those tomatoes that I've been growing all summer long and the cherry tomatoes, they crop for a very long time. They've always had access to light, air and water and nutrient. I've had enough out of those and I need to start thinking about swapping them over. So they're not going to stop until you rip them out and put the next one in. You have to kind of make that decision and go, right, you're coming out, that's enough of you because I need the time and I need the warmth and I need the length of daylight hours to get the next load of cropping in. So you sort of want to be quite proactive in that part of your gardening. And there's lots of different ways people you know, you can keep a garden journal, it's a very English garden tradition, keeping the garden journal, and there's some that have been published because they just keep going for that long that it's such a wealth of knowledge where you record your harvests, you record, you know, your wins and your losses, pests and disease, min and maximum temperatures. In some cases you might record, you know, humidity and rainfall, and then you can look back and go, well, I had this sort of problem or I had this success and what were the mitigating factors. And it just gets better, what time did I pull that out this year and what were the temperatures at the time. So it is, I think for people who have gardened where I am, again, you know, central Victoria, so very, very hot and very dry and some reasonably cold winters like proper frost and that sort of thing. But it's been, you know, anyone who's only gardened in the last 3 years there has had cold springs and more moisture, well above average moisture levels through summer. Now, this coming year, it's probably going to be not the case. So it's good to, you know, as gardeners, you talk amongst yourself. Like I talk about gardening for a job, but I certainly do it outside of work as well. You know, talk about your experiences and wins and losses, and record them in some way. If I'm not a journal keeper, although I am finding, you know, I'm 46 now, so I'm probably not. The memory's probably not quite as sharp as it was when I was 26. So I might have to start keeping a journal. So I don't have any surprises that I haven't thought about. But do think about that. The other thing when you're talking about any time that I'm doing anything on vegetable gardening, you know, small space or otherwise, and people go, what varieties? I don't want to give someone a list of this is what you want to grow, because it might be what I want to grow, like radishes. You know, I grow lots of different types of radishes and lots of radishes. But if you don't eat them, there's no point growing them. So in small space gardening, you want to get the most bang for your buck, which is through selection, through stuff that's quite quick. Like carrots are an interesting one. You can certainly do it, but it's a long-term crop. So it takes quite some time to grow a carrot. So maybe you don't want to devote that amount of space to something that takes that long. Maybe you do want to, focus on really quick cropping varieties. Even leafy greens, like if you go and buy a handful of salad mix from a greengrocer or supermarket or wherever, it's not a lot because you're only buying this little amount. But if you look at it as a kilo price, it's huge. It's criminal almost, I would suggest, because it's so easy to grow and you can pick what you want, and then the plant, there's hearting lettuces like cos and icebergs, so that is you grow the lettuce and you harvest the whole lot. But then there's all the picking lettuces, which you just harvest what you want and it continues to grow until finally it gets too hot and it'll go to seed. And then self-seed probably too. So they certainly have done in my garden. And you can do, I can't stand salad mix. I think it's very lazy salads. And when you look at a seed list, like we'll say the Diggers seed list, and you look at, there's just masses and masses of different lettuces, and they all have slightly different, and other greens like radicchios and rockets and mizunas and all sorts of, and giant red mustard and all sorts of cool greens, and quite specific. You can't. It's like if you like a Waldorf salad, you can't have a Waldorf salad with a salad mix. It's got to be a particular bitter cos lettuce. Caesar salad's got to be a cos lettuce. If you're having a sort of like a Thai beef salad, you want a crisp, you want an iceberg. You want a crisp lettuce. If you're having a French salad, you want soft, buttery, mild lettuce. And so I'm always, if I'm eating out and the salad comes and it's a couple of tomatoes and just a dollop of generic salad mix, I'm usually pretty nonplussed, and quite openly nonplussed. But then if I go somewhere where the salad has been matched with the rest of the meal, there's one I'll talk about that. It was actually parsnip greens, which parsnips are a hugely long. In small space gardening, I love parsnips, but you'd really want to love parsnips because they take ages. But the greens are good, but it was, basically it was horseradish and parsnip greens, which parsnip greens are sort of, the carrots, parsnips, parsley, celery, coriander for that matter, it's all the one family. So they're like a really strong, slightly thicker, toothier parsley. So think about what things cost and what you want out of it. If you haven't done a lot of gardening too, a lot of people when they first go into it, you have great high ideals, and you sort of want to boil the ocean to a degree, and do everything, and and feed yourself from your garden every day and produce everything, which is a great ambition, but go into it in steps, I would suggest, and think about that quick and easy stuff and then build on it. The other thing, if you're, is with that talking to gardeners, and that, I suppose, managing your soil nutrition as far as that crop rotation, it might be that you crop rotate with your neighbour. You both might have small space, and one year someone does the tomatoes and someone else does the chilies or the cucumbers or whatever it may be. So if you have the opportunity and good neighbourly relations, or your friends and family, think about even splitting that crop rotation up, so that you don't have to miss out, so to speak, but you're also not mismanaging your soil nutrition. And I suppose the other part of crop rotation, and particularly in relation to tomatoes, is a build-up of pests and diseases. If you continue to grow them in the one spot, that happens. And the other thing I would say is, both for beauty and pollination and attracting good bugs, not just pollinators, but parasitic wasps that'll you know, lay their eggs in aphids and have them puff up like a balloon, and it's good fun to watch. For it's the little boy in me loves seeing that in the garden. But give some space to flowers. Like so, in flowers and even like, you know, if this is the space you've got, you might have, like on the picture, you've got your tomatoes at the back. You can have lettuces and basil and stuff. Even think about having some perennial plants, so not annual cropping, that you might just leave tucked away in like thyme would be good, like even in the, you know, creeping thyme. And when you've got any of those really fragrant foliaged herbs, so thyme, rosemary, you know, oregano, any of those sort of tough Mediterranean ones, they're really good for, you know, when they flower, they're really good for pollinators as well. But when they give off so much fragrance in the air that you have flying insects that just can't sort of hone in on what they want. Like there's too much smell, and it just confuses them. So it's a lot harder for them to go, right, there's the basil, I'm heading straight for that, because there's, you know, there's thyme and rosemary in the air, as well as beauty, and then you can harvest them as well. So it's sort of, it is flowers and vegetable gardening. You know, so the traditional ones, you know, in summer, marigolds, you know, little French marigolds, but go for diversity, and even allow a few things to think of. If you think of diversity of colour, diversity of flowering time, and diversity of form of flower. So a really important flower form for companion planting, not for the pollinators or for anything like that, but for parasitic wasps and ladybirds, is umbral flowers. So, you know, those lots of tiny little flowers on individual stems that form umbrellas, little flat tops. So, you know, there's things like Queen Anne's lace. In my garden, I generally do it with herbs, with you know, dill, coriander, ledum seed, and they're perfect for it. Carrots, you know, I'll leave carrots into their second year, so they're unedible, but they'll flower, and their flower is the same. And it's a perfect little, you know, the parasitic wasps feed on nectar, and they're quite small. Well, there's different sizes, but quite small. So those individual simple flowers, but the small individual ones are just, that's the perfect landing spot for them, and great feed for them. And then if they notice, you know, a caterpillar or an aphid or something in your garden, they'll go and lay their eggs in it. So it is, I suppose, you know, a lot of my professional and personal gardening these days, like I love flower gardening, but, you know, until the age of 24, if you couldn't eat it, I had no time for it. But I did learn quite quickly that makes things very, very hard, pest and disease wise. So I started doing the, you know, cornflowers and marigolds basically is probably where I started. Nasturtiums in shadier spots are really fantastic plants, and you can eat them too. They're nice peppery green, and the flowers are edible, so colour a salad or any dish. But yeah, I'll just bang them in where I had space. And then eventually I got to the point where I got a bit more critical about how they look together, and I started in the vegetable garden arranging flowers, and now I love arranging flower gardens. But definitely flowers. Smaller containers as well. Like if you've got, you know, a wonderful food cube set up, or, you know, linked, and you multiple beds, and you don't really have space in there, or you don't want, you know, a rosemary that can grow quite large to take more than a quarter of your bed, stick it in a pot. Yeah, little clusters of pots in and around your larger raised beds is, yeah, I'm doing the same actually at the moment.
We've done some plants, the herbs like basil and parsley, well, they weren't actually ready at DAK, so we're still going to pick them up, and like the oregano and thyme with some things that work with others, and then we've done the bay leaf, the mint, the rosemary, and then we're doing sage and tarragon together in one other pot. Like they're 4 separate pots. So
yeah, great idea and great use of space.
Friends who are really into gardening and buy from her, and flowers.
Yep.
So.
And then there's certainly is, as I've talked about, that use vertical space, you know, both going up from a raised bed and where applicable, trailing down. I mean, you can have maybe not a huge, big roasting wild pumpkin, but a potty marron or some, you know, smaller French variety maybe, or a cucumber or, you know, a button squash or something. You know, you can have that here, and then the plant itself doesn't need to be in the soil as long as the roots are in the soil. So you're not taking up the bed space where you can put other plants. You can grow small pumpkins. You might need to make little hammocks for them if they get too heavy, but you can grow small pumpkins, small zucchinis and squash, and certainly cucumbers vertically as well. So vertically and then trailing down. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And as I said, you know, garden consciously. Like, so, you know, if something goes right or wrong, there's going to be reasons for that. So you can either repeat the success or avoid the failure, repeating the failure. Do a bit of what work backwards. Like, what are the factors? What went wrong? And then you'll have more success next year. Is the way. Gardening should get easier. It doesn't get easier on your back, but another good reason to have a raised bed is it's a lot easier on your back.
Like that with the feet and like 700 mil with the cladding and stuff, that's good for us. Like,
yeah.
That's why we've done it on a timber deck and all that.
There is actually Kerry, who I work with a lot at Diggers. We actually, when we're going to talk to Bill, the head gardener at Heronswood, because we do a lot of little filming for tutorials and very simple sort of stuff. But I like the idea of doing a really old Central and South American approach to agriculture, I suppose, called Three Sisters. So it's great for small space, and I want to trial it in this. And basically the concept is you grow corn, so lots of vertical space. You grow squash, so it could be, you know, squash is a very generic term for North American as opposed to European cubrate, so pumpkins and zucchinis and stuff like that. But yeah, so zucchinis and squash, you grow that, which forms a ground cover. Furry leaves and stems makes it harder for crawling, or caterpillars particularly, to crawl. They hate crawling over those little fine hairs, so it can sort of help caterpillars from getting up your corn. And you grow, and then you grow beans. So it's all summer cropping stuff. And then you grow beans, which will twine around. So the corn, or you could use sunflowers, but corn are the stems for support stems for your corn. So you're sort of getting 3 crops for one in that sort of space that work really well together. So we're kind of keen to use a food cube at Heronswood to just fill the whole thing with that Three Sisters planting and see how we go, because it should be, you know, corn. I'm traditionally an in-ground gardener, so I don't have a 110 litre reservoir at the beck and call of my plants. And corn needs a lot of water, sweet corn, and, you know, hybrid sweet corn particularly. And if it dries out, it affects your end result. So I grow corn purely for emotional reasons. There's absolutely no logical reason for me growing corn. I like the look of it. I like the sound of it when the tassels are out. But also at the same time, I'll harvest my corn and I've got, you know, it's dried out more often than I should have let it because I'm at work, or, you know, I'm not there to water it in those extremes. And I'll get, you know, 2 heads of corn per plant. They've dried out, the quality's not what it should be.
You got popcorn.
And I've pretty much got popcorn, or I've got more chicken feed is actually what I've got. And they love it. They peck it cleaner than I do. But yeah, then you go to a greengrocer and, you know, it's 50 cents a cob. And you go, well, what have I done? So yeah, my reasons for growing corn are there's no logic to it. It's purely I like growing corn and like the look and the sound of it, basically. But the Three Sisters could be, if you're interested in growing corn,
every month.
instead of like what we did in the trials of those varieties, they were just, I think there was 6 varieties, so we had 6 food cubes and just one variety per cube. You might want to think of doing something like Three Sisters in that small sort of spot. Now, do we have any questions?
That's very good. I wonder if you could talk about the growth medium.
Yep.
We set up a couple and use the
They can.
Yeah.
I mean,
stuff.
they can.
Because over a period of time it tends to deplete.
Absolutely will. Yep.
It's growing. We're starting to
I just
do a bit more.
want to know how to manage that. So it's all very well growing, peas and beans.
Yeah. Well, you're going to get to a point where, because there's managing nutrition within the mix and within the water well itself, but then there's the structural elements. So whether it's a normal type potty mix that you have in a traditional type pot, or it's a growing media, like a wicking growing media that has more air, so it has more capillary action, it sucks more water up, you're going to have part of the bark particle, the composted bark particle, break down, and so you're going to get smaller and smaller particles, which gives you smaller and smaller air space, and you'll get less. One, that's not healthy for a root system. You need water, but you need air. So growing media is about air-filled porosity, which in the case of wicking, more air-filled porosity means more capillary action, more wicking, so it'll suck more water up when it dries out and it needs it. So the only management is it's expensive, it's very, you could make your own mix, but it's 6 years in university. It's not just banging a few things together to make a really good mix. And you could read, there's a book I certainly have on my bookshelf that I'd be very hard pressed to recommend to the home gardener, because it's a textbook and rather heavy going, but it's growing media for ornamental plants and turf, or Hendrickson Black is what it's referred to, the author's name, and that'll tell you everything you want to know and make your head hurt about making your own growing media. And as a younger gardener, I used to make my own fertilisers and make my own mixes, but it was more part of my learning process, because I'd end up having to buy a whole bunch of stuff and mix it together, and it was not only time consuming, it was a hell of a lot more expensive. And the same with the fertiliser. I'd buy, instead of just having a good organic based all-purpose fertiliser, I would buy basically the first 30 elements of the periodic table, but that was a learning process, and filled my shed up with way too much stuff. Some of it that I've still got and I'll never use again. It's just got cobwebs and dust on it. It's expensive and time consuming, but there's no getting around. I have seen on certain shelves, magic liquids that you pour on your old potty mix, and it brings it back to life. It's about the physical structure. So you don't have the right, look, an old bugger that I used to work for when I was very, very young, one way he used to put it that I use all the time is, you want it to be muesli, not porridge. So you want mixed particles, you want some chunks, because all those mixed particles will mean you've got the negative space that they leave, the pores, you've got small ones that will fill with water, and then you've got large ones that will sort of suck water in and be coated around here, but then they suck oxygen in. And there's no miracle liquid to make that happen.
I think what you're saying is
you've got to replace it.
You've got to replace it.
Yep. But you want to manage through. I would want at least 4, if not maybe a bit more. I want a lot more than 1 year, because I would say if you're doing 4 to 5 crop rotations, so that's, if we say 4, that's 2 years. I'd want to get 2 lots of that, because it's too expensive to be doing it any other way, but there's no other way to do it.
I think the information indicates up to 3 years for, that you can use the same method.
You could push it with some really, probably things like carrots and radishes, but probably things like carrots, you could probably push it a little bit further, but you'll get diminished results, and you'll get diminished wicking, diminished root development, and also you'll end up, like you do end up with populations of really good things that you can't see, whether it's in the ground or in something like this. And the good guys, like if we're talking bacteria, the good bacteria are aerobic bacteria, and then bad bacteria are anaerobic. So you'll get to a point that conditions are more beneficial to the anaerobic bacteria you don't want, instead of the bacteria you do want. That's sort of the bacteria, if you look at, like we think of ourselves as being singular, like, we have sort of one consciousness and, we're one being, but we're far from it. We've got, fungus and bacteria. Our immune system and our digestive system is like internal populations of things that live in us that if they weren't there, we'd be in a hell of a lot of trouble. So plants don't have it internally, they have it around their roots. And, as far as, plants, feeding, fertilising, most fertilisers, and the better way to fertilise, so you are promoting good probiotics for your plants, is organic. But when you put down an organic fertiliser, the plant isn't eating that. What happens is fungus and bacteria process it, and then it's soluble to the plant. So they're external, unlike us, which is internal, but it's kind of very, very similar. But you need that oxygen for that purpose. And if I got to the end of the road too, it's a bit like if you do traditional hot, multi-bayed composting. If I was getting to the end of the road and I needed to completely replace that mix, not just top it up or pour a magic liquid on it or anything, but I'd pushed as much as I could out of it. I would probably have a shovel from the guts of that and use that as like a starter culture, because starting again means you're going to have to build up that beneficial fungus and bacteria again. So you've got a little start culture and chuck that in but only like one shovel load, so you're not diminishing the structure. But yeah, so there will come a point in whether it's in a pot or in a wicking bed, where you need to replace the media, because it is soilless growing. It's different to soil growing. Now you could get really interested in, if you've got some, if you're doing things on a reasonably big scale, but in a system like this, and you've got the space and the interest in organic chemistry and how it relates to soil and that sort of thing, you could go into your own media production, but you're going to probably want to know a fair bit about it, and it might end up being more expensive than just biting the bullet and replacing it.
So would you throw that old soil back into either your garden or through your compost heap?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah.
And this might be a really stupid question, but I often look at mine and go, would worms be happy in there, and would they be...
Worms would be, but they're not. I mean, worms process organic matter, so I don't know what benefit the worms would have in there, because processing, basically what that means is the more worms you have in there, the quicker the structure of that growing media is going to deteriorate, because they're eating it and making it smaller. I don't. There's no real benefit to having worms. You definitely could, but there's no benefit.
We've actually just planted. So we were looking at the composting, the worms in there, because we can't do composting where we live, and the structure of the composting things to go in the garden beds were way too big. We actually went to we're at Bunnings. We found pots that had holes in the side, and they're like 80 cents each or something. We cut the bottoms of them off, tip them upside down, put them in. We've now put the soil and the worm eggs
Yep.
in there. They take about 6 weeks. And then we've used the base plates that we bought, that were like 20 cents each or whatever, on top with like gnomes on top, we could put a rock
Yep,
or something. And then basically we put them in corners where it was kind of less shady or that worked. And then I've already started to cut up my vegetables, started to freeze them in freezer bags. And then what I'll do is I'll defrost them overnight or whatever, and then I'll put a bit in each of them.
Yep.
And that's the way that organic matter will work, because we were told that we can put worms straight in there. You just need to have something for them to eat off.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yep.
So that's what we've done. Yeah, if you go to the black, like just the pot section in one of the aisles, there's pots with the size on them. and they'll
Orchid
fit in
pots.
there. Yeah. Sorry?
Orchid pots. Orchid pots is what they're
Orchid
called.
pots.
Yep, because they're perfect. That air that gets in the sides is for
Yeah, they're about that big.
for growing orchids, basically.
So that does work actually. So yeah.
Yep.
We've only just started a week and a half ago. So
Yep. Yep.
no,
Ryan, could you talk a bit about the small space gardening area that is at Heronswood?
Well, look, Kerry, who I work with, and I are very, very excited. And Bill, the head gardener at Heronswood, in the last 12 to 18 months, he's worked like and the gardeners, I should say, like an absolute trooper, because we've added a whole, we've expanded the size of the garden. It used to be Digger's production nursery many, many years ago, before we had a separate one. And so he's done a lot of expansion, but so it's a seed garden basically. So it's sort of like a expanded, it's an education garden. And we're very, very keen, because we're very aware that the Australian gardeners are having less and less space. So even though it's a pretty big garden, Heronswood, we're very keen to show small space gardening. So we had a shed that was kind of just filling up with things to stay in that shed forever, and of no real use to anyone. But good sunny spot. The education room at Heronswood, good windows looking down onto it. The cafe space as well, up the top in the nursery area. But a good concrete slab, and that, pulling that shed down, it was just like, well, now we've got a small space garden within a larger garden. We've got a courtyard garden. I can't remember how many of these things are in there, but there's quite a few. And so that will be, I'm not Bill, so I don't know when it will be open, but it's taking shape, and we're very excited because it'll be like a stage. We do lots of filming of little things, and it's going to be a great stage. It's all well and good we do a lot of filming at St Earth in Blackwood, another digger's garden, but that's on a larger scale. It's a large country garden, and there's no obvious spot to make a courtyard garden there. And a lot of, I suppose, country gardeners have a bit more space. But yeah, so there'll be other pots and bits and pieces too, and citrus trees, and there's a fig tree in a pot, and instead of having umbrellas, we're going to there's a fig tree coming up through a table there that's going to be part of it. But as far as that sort of annual cropping, it's just a whole bunch of these. All joined up, makes it very, very easy. It does, it can be a lot of labour watering and a lot of cost, because watering a vegetable garden, so wicking is a great way to go about it, because it's not a closed system. You're losing water, the vegetables are using it, but it's much more forgiving than open elements and not having that. But it's coming together. No date. I would expect, I haven't been to Heronswood for probably 4 or 5 weeks, I think. And they were finishing off another area. I had the joy of, I've done a lot of different roles at Diggers, and I had the joy of being head gardener at Heronswood in I think it was about 9 months in sort of a caretaker role. And our master and commander, Clive Balazy, His enthusiasm for gardening, even after all these years, is huge. And he'd want lots of projects. And one thing he probably didn't like about my tenure is I'm a one project, finish it, and let's do another one. And Clive's got no time for that. It's, things have got to be happening. And Bill, I don't have the ticker to work like Bill does. He's a genius as a gardener. But like all geniuses, there's a nutty professor element about it. But he'll have multiple things going at once, and I just don't. And they all pull together, and he can do it, and it, keeps Clive probably happier than I did. But I don't have the ticker for it. But it should be, there should be some cropping in that courtyard wicking garden this summer, definitely.
You mentioned filming several times. Where does that go?
It goes basically to members' library. So sort of it's so Diggers is a garden club for those who don't know it, and a non-for-profit garden charity that saves heirloom seeds and promotes that and whatever else Diggers does. And so everything we do basically is derived from member support, whether that's good. But the members' library. So it's sort of what Kerry and a big part of what Kerry and I do is to add value to membership. So we look at at the moment, we generally do a small, let's say 300 to 400 word little blog. Mine usually blow out. As do my talks usually blow out time-wise. And they'll go into the members' library, and then there'll be a short 5-minute video, roughly 5-minute video, very simple, very approachable in the members' library. So we're sort of, I'm not sure how many of them are loaded up, but we've got, because we've had a few changes in our marketing department that look after that side of it, but we're just constantly feeding it up. We'll be doing some filming tomorrow at St Earth, and I was actually thinking of going, Kerry and I are quite capable of coming up with stuff, but we should also ask for feedback on, is there something particular that our members want to know about, and at what level? Or we try and sort of, Diggers is a garden club that's been going for 45 years, and about 90,000 members all across Australia, and different levels of gardening. Great influx in lockdown, I'll be perfectly honest, of lots of new gardeners. So we sort of, some things we try and keep basic without being too basic. It's very easy to, I've been a gardener all my life, and there's things that I might, and Kerry as well, might take for granted that you'd, so feedback from members on what might be a good idea. And then we're looking at sort of having, I suppose, foundation sort of level stuff. So beginner, not the basics. I think foundation is a better word than basic. And then sort of intermediate and through to advanced, and then sort of expanding on that and doing some progressive courses where be an online course, so you don't actually have to get to one of our sites.
I think there was another question down the back here.
Ideas around plants in high wind areas.
Plants in high wind.
Yeah.
See the thing you've got around the insect protection, slight shade protection, also break the wind. Because high wind it'll dry, rip the moisture out of the plant, dry the surface of the soil, and possibly damage plants. It can interrupt pollination. Some things need some wind to pollinate, like corn, but other things need an insect that, if it's really high wind. So I would suggest something to break the wind, and that would be perfect, because it's going to let air through, but not gusts through. So it's sort of like, if you think of, if you've ever taken a flight over farmland, and you've got the paddocks, the cropping paddocks, and then you've got windbreak trees in between paddocks, and particularly where there's prevailing winds. So it's kind of that scaled down, like you're creating windbreaks. Physical, but not with any windbreak at any scale, not something that completely stops the wind, because you get what's called dumping. So it's almost like surf break. The wind hits it and then dumps and crashes down over the other side. So something like that mesh is perfect because it's going to stop the brunt but not create that sort of effect, and it's going to let the it's not, I'm not a meteorologist, but it'll let probably about the right amount of air through for that sort of thing. You could do it with plants and, depending, it really, all sorts of ways, but that would be a very simple way to do it. And there's multiple benefits because you're, in the height of summer, you're getting 25-30% sun reduction, so you're not going to cook your tomatoes on the vine, or you might have, it also allows you to grow coriander and lettuce for longer into summer because it's not getting as hot and it won't bolt as quickly, and it'll work as a windbreak. Yeah.
Just two quick questions. Is there any truth to planting by the moon cycles?
Look,
Getting in the ground?
Look, what I'll say about that is, yes, there is. Like, if you think about the moon's effect on fluid, so fluid within us and the ocean, like it moves the ocean, so that gravity pull, so it's about that. It's not about dancing naked in the moonlight or any of that sort of aesthetic sort of stuff. It is about the moon and its gravitational pull's effect on where water wants to go. Is it going up or is it going down? In saying I'm not a moon planter, but there is great science behind it, and people have great success with it. But if I plant and the moisture's going up and not, yes, there's truth to it, but I wouldn't be. I'm certainly not religious about it. Yeah.
And the other question is whether it helps to add core, like dissolved core to the wicking.
If you're going to buy a good wicking mix, don't add anything to it, because it's anything you're adding is actually diminishing the job that thing's been formulated to do. If you can, diggers is there's a hell of a lot of trials is huge to diggers, and trialling all sorts of things, growing methods, varieties, all of that sort of thing. Now, you could do that as a home gardener, and I do. Like, I have done things that you go to just see what happens. But you buy a really good quality growing media. It's a wicking mix, so it's got everything it needs in it. Core is used a lot these days, and basically because it's cheap and available. If you fly over Southeast Asia and see how much palms there are for palm oil, and that all has husks, so it's a secondary, so it's quite available. It can be a bit of a problem. I've found it in using it in mixes, particularly when you get the sort of the chunkier stuff, that when that completely dries out, it has too much wicking ability, basically. So you can, if you're using it in a traditional pot that you top water, unlike a wicking pot, pot dries out, you go and water it, but it's dried out to the point that the centre of those chunks of core have dried out, and then you walk away thinking you've done a job, and instead of the water being present and available to the plant, the dry chunks will suck it up and lock it away from the plant. So it can be a little bit problematic, and never let it dry out, but I wouldn't add anything to, I'd never buy a cheap mix of any description, but also wouldn't add anything to it. Top dressing, fertiliser is different. You don't fertilise too much in these because it does reticulate, so it doesn't just leach away like it does in open ground. You are continuing to use it, so you'll know by smell if you're over fertilising, because it'll smell a little bit mildly of bleach, like of ammonia, basically. So yeah, where you stick your hose in, put your nose in it once every few years, and know if you need a bit of a flush out. When we trialled prototypes of these while I was at Heronswood, and as a country boy, I'll have to say, and all of my growing up, space hasn't been a concern to my gardening. And I'm a traditional stick a fork in the ground, and that sort of that's been my background in gardening. But we got I think 3 or 4 of the larger units, the prototypes from Biofilter, and trialled them over 2 seasons. And I'll have to say, I went into it very cynical because I'm a traditionalist. But there was a lot I liked about it. There's a lot of designs I've seen for do-it-your-own, and you make these weird layers. That same guy that I said, you want it to look like muesli, not porridge. There's many sayings of his I have stuck in my head. Turn your brain on is one of them too. But the other one is we're making a sponge cake, not a lasagna. So layers are not good, and you create perch layers. So having, unlike some, that I've seen, the thing, and I don't want to talk about all what you're going to talk about, the thing I like is you've got one, homogenised bed for your mix. So you're not trying to create these weird layers that, if you ever go on the internet and have a look on YouTube at what a perch layer is, it looks like a magic trick. And water, when you have a lot of too much air-filled porosity, so you've got that layer of, often scoria is used or suggested to be used, you've got really big pockets of air, and then you've got water coming down through smaller capillaries. So it hits that where the big pockets of air are, and the air trying to go up is more force than the gravity of the water coming down. So the water just sits there. And then there's no lack of oxygen, and there's problems at root level, and you're killing your good bacteria. So I like that, and I love this. Very simple bit, but I love that you can set your level, make sure you've got that air pocket. And when the time comes, if you are, you've over-fertilised a little bit too much, and you're getting a build-up of those ammonias, and it's got that slight bleachy smell, very easy to flush too if you need to. And those ammonias, if you've got lawn or in a garden bed, that's going to be fine, but that continual build-up's a bit of a problem. So
I think we've probably got time for maybe one more question, and then just down the back here.
Yep.
So with fertiliser and those, are you better off with like a slow release or a liquid?
Well, I use liquids to do quick boosts because it's much quicker uptake. But there's in this there's probably a bit more long lasting because the liquid will end up in the bottom. But slow release, now slow release is not control release, is a good thing to remember. So control release is little prills, those little balls. What control release fertiliser means is moisture and temperature. So if you're a big, wholesale nursery growing plants, and you're controlling your hothouses, you're controlling the temperature, you're controlling the daylight hours, you're controlling humidity, you control the release of that fertiliser because it needs to be 22 degrees before it starts releasing. But if you get to the high 20s, it just dumps it all at once. So great for the industry but no good for home gardeners because it'll only, no fertilising in winter, and then it gets to a point that it gets above, it gets to 25, 24 degrees in summer, and it'll just dump all of its nutrient at once. And it's nitrates in a form that's kind of toxic to the bacteria that you're trying to build up. so it's not good for soil health. It's cheap, and you know it says it lasts for 6 months, and you go, that's fantastic, but it doesn't really. So a pelletised, organic-based all-purpose. You don't need a yeah, there's dynamic lifter comes in lots of forms, and it's pretty rough and unbalanced in its original form. But the expensive, yeah, there's lots of different fertiliser companies out there. Look, same with potty mix. Price is a pretty good indicator. So if you're looking at dynamic lifter, I think it's called Dynamic Lifter Organic or something like that, which is a much better than Dynamic Lifter used to be, or things like Rooster Booster that are a bit rough and a bit too high in one and not in the other. You know, Nutrog is a fantastic fertiliser company. Their version's called Seamungus. They've got weird names for all of their products. Well, clever names, I suppose, in some ways. Grow Better is another good fertiliser, and theirs is just called organic fertiliser. They'll have an analysis on it, but what you want it to say, you want to make sure it says, you don't need to know the chemistry, but you want it to make sure it's got trace elements as well as the nutrition, like so the vitamins as well as the food, but organic. Yep.
Stick with the lifters?
Look, I use a combination of both. If I'm getting impatient and want a quick blast, or I've harvested a perennial herb, cut something back, I might want a quick boost, which is what I would use liquids for. But otherwise, I use a pelletised slow release organic fertiliser.
Thank you,
you very
Ryan,
much, guys.
you're welcome to start for a minute. Thanks very much. Are you able to hang around just for a few minutes
Absolutely.
after we're finished?
Yep,
so
absolutely.
if there are any other questions that you have for Ryan, you'll be able to catch him after the session.